Well, the Sams, I think, sent something to me. Well, I'm pretty sure that they sent something to me. And I didn't realize this before when I was making these videos, but I said something to the extent of that I don't believe anyone else in the Bible, but I do believe that Jesus is the Christ, etc. And I forgot to mention that there's an underlying foundation for why I believe that. And it is that I don't believe that any religion or any idea or any person or object or event should be excluded as valueless, ideally. Of course, we're all going to fall short of that by necessity. But if we could, if it were possible, if we could be the best of all possible people, those people would be absolutely inclusive of all religions, all ideas, all faiths, all events as having value and as having equal value. So even though it is to say that I believe that Jesus is the Christ, doesn't mean that I disbelieve that anyone else isn't capable, or that it isn't possible that there could be someone else that was of a better fit as the ideal. So it's like I've said before, I have enough faith, I can say that I believe that I'm right, and that's okay, and that's necessary. I need to believe that I'm right, because if I don't believe that I'm right, I wouldn't bother having any belief at all, and the default position at that point would be nihilism, which really doesn't help me do anything. In fact, it can be extremely not only self-destructive, but destructive to other people around me as well. And I don't think that's really compatible with almost any religion. So it's a necessity to have conviction of my own belief. Even an atheist would have conviction in their own beliefs. That's fine. It's just an issue when religions are excluded as saying that they have no value or that it is not possible that they have any truth to them, etc. And that goes for atheism as well. It's no idea should be dismissed and treated as if it were impossible to be true. The point is that we don't exclude or excommunicate each other. Say that, there's no way that such and such could ever be true, because what is the measure of veracity is what is the measure of truth. What is the conclusion of what is considered to be true is based off of the measure of that truth, whatever belief system the person happens to assert. And also that all beliefs are, in an absolute sense, false, because they're all truncations of the entire totality of all truth. If you were to consider the totality of all truth, would it be true? Because by the time that you've reached the totality of all truth, there isn't any truth that exists outside of that by necessity. So is it true itself? if you were to try to measure the validity or veracity of it, what would its value be? And this is when we run into the paradox of self-reflection. It's like if you have two mirrors facing each other, they're reflecting each other, and you get an infinite chain, but you don't get the destruction of both the mirrors, or the removal of the one by the presence of the other. So, if you consider the inhabitant in the environment, or the one which is included, which you might call the soul, or the property, or the endemic nature of the thing, and then the thing itself, and you consider both of those as being irreducible, where you have to have both of them and they have to be independent of each other, then, as I had said, the presence of one is not the absence of the other, and they don't destroy themselves or each other. They reflect each other into infinity. You get an infinitude of examples of that person or that thing or whatever it is. So the inclusion can happen as long as what is included is discernible from what is that which is included must be discernible from that which is including, or containing the contained. So there's an includer and an included when we talk about self-inclusion. So what that must mean is that it's parts within the total self that are included in that total self, or something like that, where it's discernible. The total self would then be discernible from the parts that it's containing. So you can resolve it by partitioning, and you can resolve it iteratively if you were to put it embedded in space or time. Then you can have iterations of it appearing in, the various contexts that it can appear in, spatially and temporally. So that the included is the self as the inhabitant of a spatial or temporal environment, and the environment is what includes the self. So depending on how you're looking at it, what resolution that you have, that paradox, like all paradoxes, can be resolved by making the domains in which they're true discernible and distinct and independent from the domains in which they're false. So when I say that all ideas are equally valid and invalid, what I'm saying is at the scale or the resolution that is measuring, let's say, the totality of all truth, then by that limit, truth being included wholly within that totality necessarily excludes the veracity, the validity of that beyond itself. It can't extend beyond itself or reach outside of itself in order to pat itself on the back and say you're a good boy or something like that. It won't work because of that same reasoning. That paradox can only be resolved by separating the domains into discernible domains. So the discernible domain in which it's true is inside of itself because it's true, and the domain in which it's considered false is outside of itself because there isn't any room for truth inside of itself. So it's included within what it would consider to be falsehood, because if it considered any information around it to be true, it would absorb it and include it within itself. But because there's a totality of that truth, that means there's an edge and a limit, and that means that there's something being excluded, which is all of the falsehoods. So anything that is outside of itself would then be considered by it to be false. And so it doesn't really make sense to use the term true or false at that stage, at that resolution, because there isn't really, if there's not room for truth outside of it, then there can't be room for falsehood. So, like I said, technically speaking, it would come up as false, anything that's outside of itself. But realistically, reasonably, it doesn't really make sense to apply a measure of veracity beyond the limits of veracity. That's a paradox right there. It's self-contradictory. It's silly. It's a non sequitur, an error at least. And so it doesn't necessitate that. The totality of all truth is false. And that's it. It means that by its own standards, it would not be able to consider anything beyond itself to be true, because there wouldn't be room for it in there. So you could also separate those domains temporally and say it hasn't absorbed those falsehoods yet, but it will eventually. Meaning, wherever we place the ruler, because of the growth of the thing that we're measuring, that ruler will eventually be absorbed within that thing. Whether it's now or later, it will eventually be absorbed. Or you can use the space. A spatial distinction between the domains like I had before, and say, well, beyond itself, spatially, everything that exists beyond itself must be false, and everything that exists within itself must be true. So the edge in between what is outside of itself and what is inside of itself, that edge is then indiscernible. It becomes unable to be measured. And so we get put into three different values depending on where spatially we stand. If we're inside of the totality of all truth, then it is true. Then the totality of all truths is itself true, because all of its parts are true. And if we're standing at its exact limit in between within and without it, then we're at the I limit, and we're saying that it's indiscernible. The validity and veracity of itself is immeasurable, because the ruler is the same size as the thing that's being measured. So it doesn't have the last notch in there to fully encapsulate what it is that it's measuring. It's right at the edge. It's neck in neck. Between truthhood and falsity, both of those being equally valid depending on where you might be standing, then gives a total rendering of indiscernibility. That whatever arbitrary limit that you ascribe to it spatially, any specific limit wouldn't give you an accurate reading, because there would be an infinite number of conflicting or contradictory readings, leaving you with a total rendering of some self-contradictory answer, because it's right at that limit. And then the third value that you could take spatially is if you step all the way outside of the totality of all truth, such that you yourself would be considered false by it. Then everything becomes false beyond itself, because there is no more room for truth, because we aren't within the boundaries of the totality of all truth anymore. We've stepped beyond that, And because we're beyond truth, then we must be in the realm of falsehood. But the irony and the weirdness of it is that we don't get to make that statement until we are ourselves considered false, and that statement is false, and the readings that I would have of it, of the totality of all truth, would be necessarily false, because they wouldn't have been occurring inside of that totality of all truth. Then it necessarily can't be true, whatever it is. So you still end up saying the same things no matter where you're standing, but your ultimate conclusion, your final rendering of the value of the totality of all truths, depends on where you're standing, and they have three different values of 0, 1, and infinity. So when I say indiscernibility is equivalent to 1, it means that there is a value, but we don't know which value it is, because there's only one totality. We can't measure the difference between that totality and the value of that totality, because they are indiscernible from each other. There's no way to measure the distance between them other than to say that that's the smallest discernible unit that you could have, and so that it renders a value of 1. So that whatever it is that you say, let's say at that level, the limit of the totality of all truths, right at the edge, right at its fence, right at the extreme periphery, but not beyond it, but not within it, just right at the totality of all truth, then, which is where you would find the truest answer, I would say, because that's where the edge is. That's what's defining the difference between the totality of all truths and everything else. So, depending on how you define the totality of all truths, then necessarily you'll have arbitrated a particular limit in between it and everything else. But it by itself, by its nature, doesn't have a static limit. Its limit is distance between everything that is false and everything that is true. So the distance between those can't itself have a truth or falsehood, because it's the bridge between them. So if you say that, and you say that the totality of all truths at itself, we're at the level of the definition that defines what it is from what it is not, that distance is a voluminous distance. So it's an I distance because it's relative, because it's in between two points, truth and falsehood, and it's in between those to the extent that it can't be either one. And so that distance stretches to what I would call 1, because there's one of those distances, but we can't really measure anything more specific than it. Just like with the number 1, you can't really reduce further than that and yet still have whole numbers. Then you're talking about parts inside of 1, if you get more precise. And if you get larger out, then you're talking about infinity, or you're approaching infinity. I'm getting closer to infinity. And 1, the number 1 is in between 0 and infinity. It's the smallest unit of measure that you can make without making no measure at all. And that's the same thing that happens with all definitions. And the consequent explanational model and chain of reasoning then defines the limit that excludes that which is not something from that which is something. And so the parts are anything that are wholly included within those definitional limits, and everything that is outside of those definitional limits is a whole, but It's beyond the whole that we're defining, so it's excluded. So that makes every whole interchangeable or indiscernible from the definition of it, which is to say that its representative model silhouette or outline is indiscernible from it, because we're still talking about edges either way, because that's the only thing visible to us. If I were to refer to someone by their skin color or hair color or shirt or clothes that they're wearing, or their name or where they live or something like that, these would all be edges that define what that person is or who that person is from everyone else. And the more of them that we have, the higher the resolution, the higher the specificity, the more accurate that we can make those outlines or silhouettes of who that person is. And by accumulating an infinite number of those, then we would have the full rendering of what it is to be that person, excluded from everything that the person is not. But that limit itself is basically what is defining that limit. It can't really define itself. The rendering that it would have about itself would just be that it is itself, but it can't include its voluminous definitional limit inside of itself. It has to include its parts, but it can't include itself. It can only include the parts. Because if it treats itself as a part of itself, then it's like a box that contains itself. That doesn't make sense. It's not possible for a box to contain itself. There's the box that's contained and the box that's the container, but there is no way for it to contain itself, because the contained can't contain the container. So all of that is to say that like I've been trying to say, you can't reduce everything into a binary, and that's why we can't exclude, because while I might say not P, that doesn't necessitate Q or R. It just means that we've got to take both Q and R into account. It's either P or Q or R. It can't be either P or Q and that's it. Because if you say either P or Q, whatever premise that I make next defines the next one. So it's like check. It doesn't it doesn't matter if you move or not. It's actually more like checkmate. It doesn't matter where you move. You're fucked. There's nowhere to go. It doesn't actually, all it does is delay the inevitable. Anywhere that you would move, any change that you would render, anything that you would say, anything that would matter, that would be relevant to P or Q, would define whether or not P or Q is true. And so if I say P or Q and that's it, the very next premise is going to have something about P or Q in it. And unless I'm making an infinite number of additions where I just say, again, P or Q or R or S or T or whatever, if I do that, where I just infinitely tack on more additional variables, then I'm already seeding the point that you have to have more than just P or Q. And if I do anything other than that, then I'm going to define which once and for all P or Q is actually true. Because if I say, I can't say P and Q, because if it's P and Q, then P or Q is, what is that? Superfluously specific. It doesn't need to be the case that it's a disjunction at that point. The disjunctive nature of it becomes arbitrary instead of necessary. So we then have to either use it as a given, as something that's asserted, that P or Q is true, which is the way that we've had to render it so far, or we have to change that and consider it to be arbitrary, at which point we've ceded the point again that you have to have more than just P or Q. If we do a negation of P, then we end up with Q. If we do a negation of Q, then we end up with P. And so, like I say, there isn't anywhere to go if all we have as a given is just P or Q. There is nothing that you could render from that because it's an irreducibly, it's a, what do you call that? It's too simplistic for it to be true. There isn't enough complexity in that universe of discourse, in that world in which the height of veracity is determined by a binary of variables. There aren't enough variables then to account for all things. That is only ever going to account for a partition of things. So you won't ever be able to go to a limit of complexity that would include anything beyond a single whole, because that's the limit at which you're defining the definition of what that whole is from what it isn't. You can say that using only two variables, P or Q, that which is within the limit from that which is beyond the limit. You can do that, but you wouldn't be able to define anything except that one whole. And if that's all that there was, that can't include itself within itself either. And then you run into the final paradox, which is that if all there was P or Q, then P or Q could not be true, because it would either have to include itself, which is impossible, or it would just not be true to begin with, which is inevitable. So you can't use a binary, and because you can't use a binary, you can't use an exclusive or, where there's only two variables. There has to be at least three variables which are independent and discernible and distinct from each other in order to render anything as with enough complexity of information to actually define what it is from what it isn't. Because you can then take the binary definition of what is and what isn't something, and you can embed that within an environment, at which point you've got enough complexity that you can finish the testing of the claim P or Q by using R as an independent third party that measures the veracity of P or Q. But you have to have that third variable being independent and included within the measuring of the veracity of any given claim. Which is really just a long-winded version of repeating the same thing that I had said before, that I learned nothing about blackness by removing whiteness or vice versa. Because the removal of something that is white could be just the absence of something, which is just nothing, and nothing isn't black. Nothing is nothing. So I don't learn anything by simply negating something else. And because black is not, Alan Watts says this, and I can't disagree more. He says black implies white, self implies other. And while that's very confidently and poetically said, it's very pretty, but it isn't true. It's just not the case. Because if you were to take anything and reduce it to a binary where there's only two variables, self or other, black or white, if those are really the only two variables in existence, then the one is simply the opposite of the other, which means that neither of them have any definition, because one of them is simply the opposite of what the other one is. And try to create an abstraction where there's, let's say, P or Q. That's why I like using those terms, because it's so abstract that you can't get away with the intuition that comes with blackness and whiteness. It's easy to fall under sway of that because you already know what those are. And so it's easy to fool yourself into believing that the thing that you are knowing what it is, which is whiteness and blackness itself, that you already know what that is, and so then it becomes easy for you to say that one of those implies the other one, because you know both of them already. And then you say, having known what both of these properties are, and then conjoining them and embedding them within a single framework, I can then conclude that one of them implies the other. And that is true. But he's smuggling his own understanding as a third variable, R, into that equation to discern the veracity of the one from the veracity of the other, from the presence of the one from the presence of the other. And it requires that third independent variable R, which is the knowledge of the property of P or Q, in order to be able to discern what those are. So it itself does not imply other until there's a third party, or until there's a second other or a second self, which is viewing that relation between the self and the other. But if self really implied other, and it really was that black and white, then all selves would be aware of all others. And we know that's not the case. So if self really implied other, the way that Alan Watts says that it does, then every self would imply and be implied by every other, which means that there would have to be a way of deductively reasoning the exact nature of every other self simply by measuring my own self. And if that were true, I would like the proof of that, please, because I've never seen it. So if someone claims that they've reached that, well, isn't that cute? Where is your proof that that's the case? And if somebody were to give me that proof where they've got a deductive chain and they've not smuggled in any third party variable, where they only have two variables, the self that was originally given to them as knowledge of themselves, and thus given that the necessary conclusion, the implied other. If that's possible for you to make that leap with, you've got the one and you can automatically predict the other, that's something that you can scientifically prove. Because I could put you in an environment in which you're not empirically, objectively aware of some other, and then I ask you to describe that other by using pretty much the equivalent of remote viewing. It's the same claim that you can know some other simply by reading the self, that you can look inward and somehow see outward, etc. So if that really were actually true and not just a silly, pretty, poetic way of saying a bunch of gibberish, then it would be capable of being proven. You could put someone in a situation where they don't know Bob is on the other line, and then they have to guess, is it Bob or Sally? Before they already know, empirically, they should be able to know intuitively from what Alan Watts has said. If that were true, that's what we would have expected to be able to find. But unfortunately, self does not imply other. Self and other are implied by the environment. There's three always, not two, three. So he's close, but he's yet, what is it? What is that statement? So close and yet so far. He's like right there, so close, he's just one off, but that one off is a vast universe of difference. Because when we say that there's an environment in which the self and the other must exist, and that environment is simultaneously defining the self and the other, then we can say, aha, that's where the veracity, that's where the measure is of the self and the other. The measure of those is in the environment. So that we've got an independent third piece to fit that puzzle. So if I wanted to know if it was Bob or Sally on the other line, then I can read the environment and I can gain clues about the identity of the person on the phone by looking at the environment. Is Bob or Sally present outside of the room in which that telephone is known to exist? So that by reading the environment, I can then know the identity of the other. And that's the true way of being able to deduce who is on the phone. Not by simply magically intuiting some mystical quality that exists inside of myself and somehow magically intuit the identity of the other on the other line through direct relative transmission, because of there only being the self and the other, which, like I just proved, is not really feasible. And if it were true, it wouldn't be provable, at least. So I don't buy it. But maybe it is that way, but I don't have any proof that would sway me in that direction. Because if I did, I wouldn't be able to measure the veracity of that. Because again, it would become relative. So